All right, our buddy Idrees Ali is back on the program with us. He's a fantastic Reuters Pentagon correspondent. Idrees, Mike, and Nick, thank you so much for hopping back on the podcast with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Idrees, I saw somebody write on the comments to you in social media about these. This is a story you were born to cover, and I'm so glad that you're able to join us here. But we've got like 5 of these stories, Idrees, so you got to cover a bunch of these. I would love for you. In our last episode, we talked a little bit about high level, the different incidents. Obviously with February 4th and the Chinese spy balloon, and now obviously the 10th, 11th, and 12th, and these unidentified flying objects that have been shot down by the U.S. government. Can you take our audience in the 30,000 foot overview here? Be careful for objects flying around, but can you break it down and tell us a little bit about each of these and what you're hearing from the U.S. government as to why these objects were shot down?
Yeah, yeah. So thanks for having me. Just broad overview. Um, since 9/11, the U.S. has essentially said our main priority is to protect the homeland. And since then, there has not really been an attack uh, on the homeland from the air, right? The U.S. hasn't had to use fighter jets in any instance. It hasn't had to fire air-to-air missiles. Since February 4th, the US military has shot down 4 objects. It has fired at least 5 Sidewinder missiles that are used to, for air to air combat. And the only other time an F 22 or a US jet had had an air kill was in Syria, many years ago. And then you have to go back decades. So to just put that in context, in the past 2 weeks, we've seen more military action for the Pentagon over North America than decades combined during war even. And so the first one that really came to attention was the Chinese spy balloon that you mentioned, and that was very obvious. People in Montana could see it, and the Pentagon publicly spoke about it. And then we saw it traverse, the length of the United States from Montana down to South Carolina, and it was shot off the coast. It's very interesting. We kind of expected it to be over, a one-off incident, and then a couple of days later, as things were dying down, we hear that the Pentagon had shot down another object over Alaska, and this was a bit different because it was defined as something that was much smaller in size than the Chinese balloon. The Chinese balloon was the size of 3 school buses, the payload, just the payload, and it was 200 feet tall. The object that was shot down in Alaska, so the first object, because the first one was the Chinese balloon, the first unidentified object, or UFO really, was the size of a small car, and it was shot down over Alaska. And you're like, all right, well, there's probably something stray that's been caught up in all of this, and that's pretty much it. The next day is a Saturday now, and we're all asking questions. Okay, what was the object that was shot down on Friday? And they're like, we don't know much, but you should stay tuned. Most of us thought they were talking about the object shot down the day before. Turns out the Canadians had noticed that there was an object over their Yukon territories, which are, basically northern Canada, sub-zero, what you really think of as, the far north. And they had noticed an object. The Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau, determined it was a threat, and that too was shot down by American jets, one American jet. So now we're at 3 objects that have been shot down, and people are sort of confused. Okay, is this going to be a daily thing? And sure enough, on Sunday, I believe February the 12th, the fourth object, third non-balloon object, is shot down uh, around, it was at the 20,000 feet altitude, which is interesting because most commercial airliners use 40,000 feet as sort of cruising altitude. So people were a bit confused. What's really the threat here? Anyway, that is shot down. Um, Again, this one pops up over Michigan, and that is shot down by another U.S. jet, F-16 in this case. And we probably talk about this later, but it took 2 missiles to shoot this down because one of them missed. So, you know, to sort of bring it together, each one of these was a high flying object. Each one of these, according to the military, could have posed a threat and so was shot down. But each incident was different in terms of the altitude, the location, and the other thing that's similar is, other than the Chinese balloon, no remnants have been found for any of these because they're in such remote territories. So that's sort of bringing you up to speed on each incident, broadly speaking.
Drews, from what we know so far, has there been any similarities between the technologies of the four unidentified objects that have been shot down?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think it is helpful, at least it has been helpful for me to make two buckets of this. One bucket is the Chinese balloon, and the next bucket is these three objects, which no one's calling balloons, but they might be balloons. So with the Chinese balloon, that's what we know the most about, and that is actually pretty interesting because we have been told from sources that it is no doubt a surveillance balloon. It has, I wouldn't say sophisticated, because sophisticated would be satellites, but pretty decent level of communication, essentially grabbing equipment in terms of, if there's a cell phone tower, this balloon was capable of sucking up information from that. So if, potentially you were using your phone and you were in the radius of the balloon, you potentially could have had your information or metadata or something scooped up by that. The other interesting thing is that it was able to basically move, not with the jet stream or wind, but it had some sort of propulsion system. So it was capable of physically being able to maneuver, which is, not something I would normally think of in a balloon. So that's the Chinese balloon, and again, fairly sophisticated as far as balloons go. The other ones we actually don't know much about, but what we do know is they don't appear to be able to propel themselves. And so they might be at the mercy of jet streams, winds, all the weather. They don't appear to have any major surveillance equipment. The object that was shot down on Sunday, they said, it flew over some potentially sensitive sites and had the potential to carry out some sort of snooping, but we just haven't seen any actual evidence that there's equipment that was in there. But it was very much surveillance equipment in the first one.
Idrees, I want to get on the first one a little bit because I saw something earlier today on the lead with Jake Tapper, and I think CNN has been covering this a little bit about potentially that Chinese spy balloon wandered off course and maybe being pushed by strong winds, according to the U.S. intel. And I think the second part of the question and this two-parter is really, we've heard a little bit about previous balloons, one under the Biden administration, a few under the Trump administration that kind of flew under the radar. What are we making about our relationships right now with the Chinese? We've been getting a lot of comments into our inbox that people are like, should we be taking these as threats more serious? But then that report today tends to suggest that this may have wandered off course and it wasn't intentional on the Chinese part, hence the reaction by the Chinese saying that, the U.S. shooting this down was, an act of war, according to them. So what do you make of the balloons that weren't reported on? And with respect to the newest report that this may have wandered off course?
Yeah, so you're right. There have been multiple balloons going back to the Trump administration. I actually think, and from everything I understand, the U.S. wasn't going to publicize this balloon either. What made them in a position to have to publicize it is they declared essentially a NOTAM, an area where flights couldn't go in Montana. And that got local people very confused and asking questions. And it was going to come out in the press. I think they were forced in this instance to actually talk about it. They had no intention of otherwise talking about it. And it was in the middle of America. And so people could see it. The other ones were more Hawaii and Guam. Your second point is interesting. So we also had a US official tell us that the Chinese balloon was meant for Hawaii and Guam and essentially strayed into continental United States because of air winds. what makes me doubt it, and other officials I've spoken to question this narrative, is this had a very maneuverable propulsion system that was able to propel itself over pretty sensitive sites in the United States. So for the jet stream to coincidentally go over US nuclear facilities and US military sites, they're doubting that. The other thing is the balloon was able to essentially stay in place. There were like 125-mile gusts up at 60,000 feet, and this balloon was not moving. And their argument is it just doesn't make sense. It would have, if it was, just straying around, it would have just gone with the wind. Instead, it, loitered over some sites. So there's, I think, a disagreement or conflicting views within the U.S. government of what this is worth. The reaction from the Biden administration was very publicly was one of it's actually pretty strong because they canceled a visit by Secretary of State Antony Blinken to China to protest it. But everything after that has been very muted. I think Biden, in an interview with Telemundo, said this isn't really a big deal. We haven't seen the Chinese lash out militarily because there are U.S. planes in the South China Sea every day, near China every day. The Chinese have said, oh, there are American spy balloons over China. They haven't done anything. So I think the hope for both China and the United States is, no pun intended, but this will blow over pretty soon. And, the one interesting thing is these three most recent objects that were shot down, the U.S. didn't call their Chinese counterparts after any of those. They called them after the Chinese spy balloon was shot down, but they didn't make any calls after the objects were shot down because I do not think they believe, definitively at least, that they were Chinese. And I think that gives some sort of breathing room for this relationship. Secretary of State Blinken and the Chinese foreign minister are both supposed to be at the Munich Security Conference next week. And so there's some, speculation that they might meet because I think both the US and China, despite their huge differences, want to keep some channels of communication open in case there is a true, crisis.
Idrees, I'm glad you mentioned just the isolation of the actual balloon versus the objects mentioned after, because I think there has been some conflating just from what I'm seeing on social media of all of this falling under the banner of China. And that was kind of what we were getting into on Braid about a potential anti-Asian sentiment from based on editorializing of this. On the subject of the balloon, in terms of what we understand from a technology standpoint, what type of surveillance have we been able to identify as far as what could potentially be gleaned from a spy object of that height? And the word spy has been used, so we understand it's a surveillance. It's an object used for surveillance purposes.
Yeah. So, my first not interaction, but introduction to spy balloons was in Kabul when the U.S. military was present there. They had, basically had this, I don't know how many, couple 100 feet balloon. They had lofted over Kabul, and they were using the balloon to essentially carry out surveillance and spying and monitoring in Kabul and around Kabul as a security mechanism. So that was my first introduction to balloons. So it's something that's been obviously predated that by decades and decades and decades, but the Americans also use this type of technology. Now, in terms of technology and spying ability, in its most sort of raw form, it pales in comparison to satellites, right? That satellites, as high as they are, they can, hypothetically, they can zoom in extraordinarily close. They can suck up signals intelligence, which is, cell phone conversations. From a pure technological standpoint, they're far more sophisticated than our understanding of balloons. The one thing that makes the balloons not beneficial, but one of the advantages of the balloon that a satellite may not have is its ability to loiter. And that is, say over Montana, right? One of the nuclear silos is there. Satellites are in high demand for the US military and intelligence community. So their ability to just stay over the site, is pretty limited. Whereas a balloon, there are enough of them, they're cheap. You can loft one up and you can keep it over a site of interest for days, hours, however long you want. So there's a endurance standpoint that comes with a balloon that doesn't exist with satellites. And again, it's also relatively cheap. And so you can, if you wanted, you could loft over dozens of balloons over each, site of interest and spy on them. Whereas a satellite, you might be using it for one purpose, but then it might have to be retasked to another part of the world, and there's a huge shortage of that. So the advantage is really the endurance and the low cost, even if that means it doesn't have the same level of sophistication as a spy satellite or human intelligence or other mechanisms.
Quick break here. We are presented, as always, by Fresh Roasted Coffee. If you could see my screen here. Fresh Roasted Coffee since 2009. This Pennsylvania company has been delivering fresh roasted coffee. You can check out their website at freshroastedcoffee.com or shop them online through a bunch of different places. I'm going to read you something here. Nick, they roast the freshest coffee beans using the most eco-friendly roasting technology on earth. I happen to have a cup right here of fresh roasted coffee. I always record with it. Nick, why don't you tell the people, you're a coffee snob, why don't you tell the people why they should head on down to freshroastedcoffee.com and buy some of this amazing coffee?
First, Mike, let's talk about flavors. If you are a single origin kind of person like you and myself, they've got you. If you are a flavor person, they've got you as well. Flavor packs, individual items as well. And it's not just coffee, folks. You can also get tea. My wife's a tea drinker, so freshroastedcoffee.com's got her too. But more importantly, you can learn about the coffee. When you get to the website, there's a quiz that tells you what's the coffee that's best for you. Sumatra is my blend, and they got that one right. I can tell you that for sure. They'll do the same for you when you head over to the website.
freshroastedcoffee.com. Go to our episode description right now. There's a link right there, and at checkout, you're going to get a discount for this amazing tasting coffee. Head to freshroastedcoffee.com today. And now back to the show. Idrees, I want to get into the other three unidentified objects because, and obviously, John Kirby and White House Press Secretary KJP had a funny exchange where she was mentioning about there are no alien life forms or extraterrestrial activity with these objects. So we're getting the absurdity of it, and it's humorous. And I guess when everybody hears UFOs, like Nick said on the last episode, your mind kind of wanders into pop culture, and we're all thinking Independence Day. We got to get geared up, right, Idrees? But what are you hearing in terms of, because you mentioned about the recovery efforts for these three objects that were shot down is probably not going to net anything. I know one of them actually went to the bottom of Lake Huron, I believe. So we're not going to be able to potentially retrieve any information about this. When are you expecting the government to tell us a little bit more about these objects, why they were shot down, pilot information from when they were up there shooting it down? Like, what more information can we get out of the other three objects? And are we under, in essence, attack because of these objects and where they're coming into the North American airspace?
Yeah, so I'll take that one at a time. The question of retrieval. The U.S. military still believes it can retrieve at least some of each of the balloons. What makes that extraordinarily difficult, like you said, is the weather conditions. One's at the bottom of the lake, one's in Alaska over frozen ice, and one's in the Yukon. And these are, white objects over ice. They're pretty tough. So I think there's some hope in the U.S. military that they'll retrieve it and get able to figure it out, but it is a tough task. The question of when will we know more? This is one of those incidents where I don't think the administration or the government is trying to hide things for no other reason than it makes them look a bit incompetent and silly by not giving more information. I think their hope truly is, I hope they hope they find something and they hope they can brief people on it just so that it doesn't seem like, are there aliens? Are there not aliens? What's going on? This level of mystery doesn't help them in any way. And I think they're trying their best to actually get it out for purely self-interest reasons, right? So I think they want to get the information out more than anyone. The question of are we under attack is a good one. And we worked on the story a couple of days ago. And what we figured out, or what we learned, is it's not necessarily that there are more balloons or more objects, but after the first balloon was found, the top general for North America, General Van Hert, publicly admitted that the US didn't know about the Chinese balloons that had taken place in years past until recently. So the balloons were there. The Americans didn't know. Only later when they went back and looked, they're like, oh crap, there were, 4 balloons in the last 5 years. So there was this mad scramble to go back and see, okay, what else did we miss? And so in that process, they took their sensors, that are placed around the country that are meant to, defend American and Canadian airspace, and they essentially changed the algorithms and the sensitivity level. So, they'll have what they call gates. So you'll have, a radar which says, okay, find me everything that is traveling between 0 and 500 miles an hour, between 60,000 feet and 100,000 feet, right? Because that's what traditionally I think people expect to be an attack from the air, a plane or rocket or something like that. So what happened after the Chinese spy balloon incident was they said, okay, we are clearly missing stuff. Let's lower those gates. So this is a hypothetical number, but they said, let's sort of going from 0 to 500 miles, let's go from 0 to 200 miles an hour. So you start seeing some of the smaller objects that the radars weren't picking up, or they were picking up, but you weren't seeing. And they say instead of 60,000 to 80,000 feet, let's lower that to 20,000 to 80,000 feet. And so the parameters are broadened. And so all these things that were there that radars were seeing now become evident to the analysts. And so I think a lot of what we're seeing now is the US military looking at the data that they weren't looking at before, and then being like, oh crap, this is a lot of stuff. We should go check out thing X. That could be in a flight path, or thing Y. And part of it, I think, is political, because there was so much criticism after the balloon not being shot down over Montana that I think there was a sense of, okay, is this a threat? We don't know. Could this be a threat? Maybe. Let's err on the side of caution and shoot it down. And so I think we're in this situation where the US military is seeing more. The administration is being more cautious, and we saw, over the weekend, 3 shoot downs in 3 days and 4 shoot downs in 10 days.
Idrees, you just mentioned that there's a level of sensitivity to what we would consider outrage, or just an additional level of curiosity manifested by some news networks, social media, and the like. From your stance as a reporter who's observing all this objectively, does the U.S. government run into the potential challenges of trying to maintain protocol, disseminate information in the most organized and professional way, while competing with political forces from social media and other outlets that may be spurring on a reaction that normally the government wouldn't take? Because you were just, as you were saying, shooting down these objects recently, the reaction to the balloon and the criticism that they were getting about not shooting over Montana. All of that makes perfect sense. Again, none of us here are work for the government, so I think there's a level of trust we need. But just from your vantage point, what is the potential of public criticism possibly influencing the way the U.S. engages in protocol as it relates to dealing with potential threats and spying and what have you?
Yeah, so there's a good example of this that happened on Sunday. Honestly, truly, as the Super Bowl was about to begin, we got a briefing on the most recent object, and it was the 4th object that was shot down. And it was an example of the US military trying to, at least in the public affairs space, trying to stick to protocols. But this situation is so extraordinary. So a reporter from the New York Times asked General Van Herk, who's the head of NORAD, which is responsible for protecting North America as a continent, and she asked him, Hillian Cooper from the New York Times, can you rule out that the objects that are shot down are not extraterrestrial in any way? The correct answer was, yes, there is nothing extraterrestrial about this. These are not aliens. The military has a protocol and a way of doing things, which is saying things are being investigated. We can't rule anything out. That is the standard answer for everything that the US military does. Again, the correct answer would have been no, there are no aliens. But the general in this press conference said, I'm not ruling anything out. And that led to, a lot of questions being like, well, the top general isn't ruling out aliens. That they're aliens. It led to a scramble for hours at the Pentagon and White House, and a lot of like anger because you know he didn't mean it to say, but the protocols that were in place were necessitated that type of answer. That's a very niche example of sort of the public affairs version of your question. Um, and I think we're seeing that in the military sort of space sphere as well, which is, the question of, well, there's an object that's flying. Could it in any conceivable way pose a threat? If you're asked that question as a military, you look at 50,000 scenarios, and 49,999 of those scenarios are probably this is not a threat. But there's that one out of 50,000 where, yeah, conceivably it could, blow up, combust, fall, and one piece could hit a house or something. And so when you ask the question of, could something go wrong, the military will do its analysis and usually find that, yeah, something could go wrong. And I think what we're seeing now, we're now on, this is being recorded on Wednesday. There have been 4 days or 3 days without one of those incidents of balloon being shot down. I think there's been a recognition that, there is huge amounts of debris in the air that's floating around. And could it be dangerous? Maybe. Is it likely to be dangerous? No. So I think we're seeing, broadly speaking, an underreaction initially to these objects, the Chinese spy balloon, and then an overcorrection. And now we're seeing sort of normalization of the protocols in a, again, pretty extraordinary situation.
Idrees, before we let you go, I wanted to ask you a little bit about the current state of the union, no pun intended there, of what's happening on the war in Ukraine. I know President Biden last week in his State of the Union speech mentioned Ukraine, and the ambassador to the United States from Ukraine was in attendance. What's the latest on what is happening on the war in Ukraine and the U.S.'s efforts to help the Ukrainians?
Yeah, so we're 9 days away from the 1-year anniversary of the war in Ukraine. And I don't think anyone, not just reporters, but intel analysts and military officials expected that Ukraine would be standing as a sovereign state and Kyiv would still be the capital. What we're seeing right now is essentially the winter fight, which will slowly give way to the spring fight. And we expect both countries to sort of attack each other and then counterattack each other. And so what's been a relative lull in terms of gains by any country would probably give way to a lot of fighting in the coming weeks and more likely months. President Biden is going to go to Poland around the time of the anniversary to sort of show his support to Ukraine and to the region. And we had Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin in Brussels earlier this week. And his job really is to continue to get the support from other countries in terms of military aid. So what we're seeing is both sides gearing up for some unfortunately bloody fighting ahead. And the US's primary position right now is to try and get more aid and more weapons to the Ukrainians. We've seen them give tanks. The question now becomes, are they going to give jets? We haven't seen a move towards that. But so far, what we've seen historically is if there's something the Ukrainians want, and they're very public about it, they usually end up getting.
Thanks so much, Idrees, for joining us. You can catch all of Idrees's work over on Reuters or download the Reuters app. He's a fantastic Pentagon correspondent, doing a great job covering this. I mean, it's a lot, all these balloons, objects, everything flying out of the sky. Like I mentioned at the beginning of the segment, nobody better. This is a story you were meant to cover in 4 parts, Idrees. Thank you so much for hopping on the podcast with us. Continued success to you, sir. Please stay safe.
Good. Thanks for having me.
Hey, thanks for watching the Can We Please Talk podcast. Whatever clip you just watched, we hope you enjoyed it, and we hope you stick around for some more. Subscribe to the channel. My partner's over here smashing the button. Come on, do him a favor. So hit subscribe.